pretty good job of accurately, putting together what we're saying. Yeah. Okay. So we're at 12:02. So we're going to get started. Again, cameras and sound has been disabled. So please use the chat if you've got questions or the Q&A, and you're welcome to put those questions in as we go through the presentation. We can stop and address them. There's also going to be time at the end to address questions as well. So we're going to get started. So welcome to the MCC Library hosted webinar on adverse childhood experiences and a trauma-informed approach. And it is my honor to introduce you to Angie Geren Burleson. Angie, an associate polarity practitioner and certified hypnotherapist, is a community development specialist and polarity therapist committed to changing the conversation surrounding substance use and mental health by empowering individuals and connecting communities to become recovery ready through a trauma-informed lens. Angie's own struggle with addiction, family experiences, and education gives her a multifaceted and unique perspective, which has inspired her to lobby for public health-focused addiction policy, expand peer support, advocate for parents, those in active addiction and recovery alike, and organize educational events like this one we're doing today. Angie is founder of Arizona Recovers, a recovery community organization which provides harm reduction-based peer support, community and prevention, and also the project director of Arizona Adverse Childhood Experiences Consortium. So take it away, Angie. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. That always sounds like a mouthful, and every time I listen to it, it's like, ugh, can we just say,
Welcome.
I am right? I'm one of those people. So it is great to be here with you all today. I do have kind of an informational, I have more casual presentation style. And so if there are questions, I have the chat and I have the Q&A open on my second screen, which has been a lifesaver for me, especially in our COVID world of all meetings virtual, which has been pretty amazing at who we've been able to reach. But if questions come up during the thing, please feel free. Don't have to wait until the end to ask them. If you're anything like me, if I wait, I will forget what the question was going to be. So thank you again for having. Today, we're going to go through a little bit of basics of what is trauma. What is the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, the ACEs study? What does that data look like, not only nationwide, but what does it look like in our state in Arizona? And then what are some things that we can do about it? How can we, come into things in a trauma-informed way? One thing I always like to mention at the beginning, whenever we're talking about trauma and whenever we're talking about adverse childhood experiences, is to, understand that we come from the awareness that a lot of times it can be hard and difficult to hear, not only the stats and the statistics that, we're looking at, but really how trauma is affecting not only children, but how it affects you as an adult in your adult health. Understanding that when we see the numbers, we see that the majority of us are affected by it. I think we all understand that in our world right now, considering that, since the pandemic, it has been given us that opportunity to understand that toxic stress spreads across, our whole world, and that none of us are immune to it. So understand that the ACEs information is information only. When I discuss ACEs, it is talking about, like, if you had a family history of diabetes, that's information that you have. You would know that, going to the doctors, you may pay a little bit more attention to, certain results than other people would because of your family history. In learning about adverse childhood experiences and childhood trauma, I would like you to look through the same lens, that this is information. This isn't prescriptive. It's not diagnostic. It is information that can guide you to understand why you may behave the way that you do, why you may have some of the health issues that you do, or understand that you're susceptible to it because of that. nothing that has to do with anything blame or shame, and understanding that if you do feel activated, where I think the more common word that people use is triggered. I feel activated is better because we're talking about our body systems and really how trauma affects our body systems. And so if you do feel activated, please take care of yourself, reach out to a supportive friend, do something for yourself. Feel free to reach out to me if you need it. Our goal for today is really to have that critical thinking piece. How does this information affect myself? How does it affect our family? What is it about the people you may know, about your job? Still have a spelling error in here. I thought I corrected that. About your community. And then how does that impact, right, the society as a whole? So really just taking that kind of thoughtful approach. And before we get started with all the heavy kind of piece, I do want us to look through the lens of hope. I want you to look through the lens of hope and resilience, and how this information and understanding that at any time that cycle of trauma can be broken, right? And that by us talking about it and of us being honest about the things that we have been through, or being honest about how it has affected other people that we may know, we are really speaking words of healing and hope and resilience. And so kind of looking at it through that lens. All right, so as we get started, trauma is, right, everybody is talking about it. And sometimes I think that trauma and is have become a buzzword, but really it has such a greater impact, and understanding truly what trauma is, maybe a little bit different than we all think, because when a lot of times when we think of trauma, we think of things like events, right? And how abuse and things like that. But when we look at what trauma is, we can see that trauma is an experience, right? It's an experience that overwhelms an individual's capacity to cope. So the traumatic events can include things like abuse and bullying, death or loss of a loved one, serious accidents, things like that. But it's more the experience the body has to whatever the event was. So for example, my two of my kids were in a car accident years ago. My son was 16 and he was driving, and my daughter was 12 and she was the passenger. And although they were in the exact same accident, they had the same mother, they had the same, upbringing, they had the same support afterwards. My daughter got a little bit more support. The accident affected them both in different ways. So they both had the same traumatic event occur. They were in the car accident, the car was totaled. My son got up the next day for work as if nothing had happened and went about his day. And my 12-year-old daughter, on the other hand, couldn't get in a car and drive anywhere with us unless she had her headphones on high and she couldn't hear anything. She still won't drive with other people. It's her 18th birthday today. She just turned 18 today. When she is driving with me, she sits with her seat all the way up so that way she can see the road in front of her. And she has talked about it in numerous classes, as that was a traumatic event in her life. And so even though they had the exact same event, they had completely and totally different experiences with it. And that is when we're talking about trauma. We are talking about that experience. So how does it affect that person's system? And what does that do for them? So just kind of having that baseline and understanding that historical and racial trauma, it would be remiss to not discuss this when we're talking about adverse childhood experiences. Understanding that historical and racial trauma is kind of almost a foundation that is brought in that children born are brought in with, right? It is that kind of like underlying piece that affects everything that it goes. Because you'll see when we're talking about ACEs and we're talking about trauma, we can see that it has an intergenerational impact, right? And I kind of akin it to telling stories, telling family stories. We always have that kind of one family story that gets passed down from generation to generation to generation to generation. And as it goes, it changes a little bit. The impact feels a little bit different to us, right? Depending on what is going on in this world, depending on where we are in our own life, the impact of that story is going to have a different effect. And that is when we're looking at historical and racial trauma, understanding that when we come into this world, they already have that foundation that has been passed down along the line epigenetically. And so the adverse experiences they may experience in this lifetime are going to compound it a little bit more. So let's move on to the adverse childhood experiences study. This study was done actually, I wouldn't say quite by accident, but a little bit by accident. Dr. Folletti had a weight loss clinic, and he had noticed that a few of his like all-stars that had lost hundreds of pounds of weight once they had lost it, about 6 months later, they started gaining it back. And in questions afterwards, in the follow-ups with him, he accidentally asked a question wrong. And within asking that question wrong, it came to his knowledge that the woman had sexual abuse in her childhood history. And so when he was doing the follow-up interviews, he would ask about experiences in childhood and realize that the majority of them had experiences in their childhood that seemed to be affecting them in adulthood, although the experience was over. And so he partnered with the CDC and Kaiser Permanente. Kaiser Permanente is a private insurance group in California, and really asked a 10-question survey to their demographics, and asked that 10-question survey of what kind of experiences did they have in their childhood. And what they did was they put them into two separate categories of adverse experiences. So they looked at 5 questions on growing up with abuse in your household. Now, this was things that had happened prior to the age of 18. And then they also looked at 5 different household challenges that child may have faced. For lack of better terminology, these were all listed in yes or no questions. And if you answered yes, you received a point. So the highest ACE score you can have is 10. The lowest ACE score you can have is a 0. And they asked the questions of, did you experience physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse? Did you experience emotional neglect or physical neglect? And then they asked about the household, if you grew up in a home that had someone who had substance use disorder, if you had a household member who faced incarceration, if you had a household member with mental illness, if you had witnessed violence against your mother, and if you had faced separation of one or more parents. And so the statistics that we will see coming up from this all comes from those 10 questions. Now, we just talked about how trauma is anything, right, that overwhelms that person's ability to cope. And I'll answer that in a second. Is anything that has overwhelmed that person's ability to cope, right? We only looked at 10 different things. This really was a study of like, I wonder, does things that happen in childhood affect your adult health? And that is what they were looking at. So to repeat for Anne, this survey was done with Kaiser Permanente enrollees. So they were insurance, they had a private insurance, right? They subscribed to a private insurance. The demographics of the population were 75% Caucasian. They were 70% college educated, and they were middle to upper class. They had enough obviously foundation that they were able to afford private insurance. And that is the demographics that the study. So when we look at the stats that are coming up next, understanding that that was the demographics of the study that they looked at. And what they found was that as the ACEs increased, so did your risk factors for not only behavioral health issues, but all of your physical health issues too, such as heart disease, stroke, diabetes, and that they all increased according to the amount of ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences, that adult had experienced before the age of 18. So in looking at the stats that we have up on the screen right now, does anything stick out to you that is like a shock to you? Or anything in particular that you are either studying on, or that you teach about, that is really like, whew, I can't believe the stats look like that? For me, I think the important piece for me was to recognize that the stats for our physical health, like the heart disease stats, jumped as much as it did for the behavioral health aspects, right? I think it's easier in behavioral health to say, well, yeah, if your child struggled in childhood with adversity, that, the behavioral health effects of that were going to be apparent. But understanding that physical health piece is also just as prevalent. I know Damien put that the attempted suicide rate going up is intense. Absolutely. If you have 0 ACEs, 0 experiences of adverse childhood experiences, which only 33% of the population had experienced, right? That your risk factors of attempting suicide are 1 in 96. But if you have as little as 3 ACEs, that your risk factor jumps up to 1 in 10. I think in our current demographics, looking at the opioid crisis and recognizing that with 0 ACEs, your risk factor of using IV drugs is 1 in 480. And that with only 3 ACEs, you are looking at a 1 in 43 for the risk factor. Also understanding that the people that are receiving services, right, are struggling, that they have experienced these things in childhood, and understanding of that. One of the comments is that the number of risk factors between 1 to 3 ACEs and 4 to 10 ACEs are closer than I would have expected. And I agree with that. And understanding that, we already have that propensity, right? The risk factor is already there. When you add adversity on top of it, just understanding that kind of cumulative effect, right? And that they're surprisingly common. 67% of them have at least 1 ACE. And when we look at our national data and our Arizona specific data, it's pretty striking. And another important piece of there's only supposed to be 1 click animation, but I guess there's 2. Another thing is to understand is that ACEs are interrelated, right? They have that cumulative effect, and that it's the number of different categories, not the intensity or frequency, that determine the health outcomes. So what that means is, if you only had 1 ACE, right, even if that ACE was persistent across your childhood, your risk factor doesn't increase because of that intensity or frequency of that one ACE. But if you add multiple ACEs on top of it, multiple adverse experiences on top of it, that is when we're going to see that kind of cumulative effect. And that's where we're going to see those risks and those health outcomes get even greater. And the really key piece on this is it's without intervention. And that word right there, that should be actually bold, bigger, and in a different color, you know, without intervention. ACEs escalate across the generations. Understand that intervention piece is a great thing, but we think about it, right? If we have parents who are struggling with their own childhood adversity and they haven't learned coping mechanisms and life skills, and they're struggling with the effects of their health effects of the childhood adversity that they had faced as a child, what kind of parent is that going to be, right? Not having the tools to be able to parent more effectively and pass that along. So what we see is that it kind of escalates where the parents may have one or two ACEs. I am so sorry. Where the parents may have one or two ACEs that the children are looking at 3 or 4. I have a tickle in my throat that will not go away no matter how much water I drink. I am so sorry. Also understanding that if there's any one ACE present, there is actually an 87% likelihood that there is more than one, which makes sense to us, right? That if you're struggling with one adversity, that there's going to be more than that. The stat at the bottom right corner that says, you know, the ACE score of 6 or higher results in a 20-year decrease in life expectancy. That's without that intervention, right? That's without that intervention or that mitigation point. If we leave ACEs untreated throughout childhood and adulthood, that is where we can see that result in the 20-year decrease in life expectancy, which makes sense when we can see the numbers of your higher risk factors for any of the health issues that they have, right? That we would kind of see those. And I think that's kind of so important that we continue to have these conversations so we can be the people that are able to intervene and are able to mitigate in that. So what are the numbers tell us? What does that look like nationwide? This is the 2016-2017 results. Now the newest results just came out. We just haven't updated our slides yet. Unfortunately, the number has actually gone up, but it still remains around the nearly half. So we're looking at 47% of the youth in the United States have experienced at least one ACE. And what's important to note about that is this is, you know, they don't take into account some of the other things that we're facing, like the pandemic, right? Like food insecurity, bullying, racial tensions, those things. And so understanding we're just kind of looking at the abuse and the neglect factors. That 20% of our children have experienced 2 or more, and that fewer than 2 in 5 flourish when they've had 2 or more ACEs. That does mean, though, that 3 out of 5, you know, do flourish, even if they've had 2 or more ACEs. So we have that intervention point, right? That kind of hope that it's not all. It doesn't have to be the worst outcome for it, right? And that as many as 1 in 7 children have experienced 3 or more ACEs, and that is nationwide. When we look at Arizona, we lead the nation in children with 2 or more ACEs. So our Arizona children, 1 in 4 of them have 2 or more ACEs. We have enough, the children who've experienced 2 or more ACEs are enough to fit in State Farm Stadium. So we have a lot of kids who are coming from, if we're looking at it, you know, increasing over the generations, we have parents that are affected, and therefore we are having children that are affected. And if we don't have that intervention point, that it will just continue to increase. We also have our African American and our Hispanic children are disproportionately overrepresented in the category of 6+ ACEs. And that children with intellectual and developmental disabilities are also at that kind of higher risk for ACEs and trauma. So before we move on to looking at more of a trauma-informed care approach and switching a little bit, are there any questions around any of the stats that have been brought up? Are there questions around this study? Are there questions around why? Any questions out there? Renee asked if we have stats specifically for Native American populations. We don't have stats specifically for. They are, unfortunately, I don't have anything that's listed out by ethnicity. We do know though that they are disproportionately represented in the 6+. I just don't have the individual numbers of what that looks like. Okay. When we discuss ACEs, we also like to kind of discuss the 3 realms of it, right? When we're looking into the future, remembering that this study was in the late 90s when it came out. It was really like I wonder, does it? And of course, since then, there has been a lot of research. In fact, new research seems to come out every couple weeks or so around how adverse childhood experiences and how childhood trauma really not only affects the child, but also affects adult health. And so we started to look at all of the different categories around, right? Like what does that look like in your household? What does that look like in your community? And what does that look like in your environment? And understanding that each one of these plays a part, right? They're not independent from each other, but they all have that cumulative effect. One of the things I always like to, when looking at this picture, is it appears to me that it makes it seem that the only way to grow the tree of adversity is to have soil that struggles, right? Is that you would have to experience structural racism, poverty, lack of jobs in order to grow that tree. And that's not what it's saying, right? We know that that's not the case. The original demographics in the ACEs study were Caucasian, middle to upper class, and college educated, right? My ACE score is a 7, and I come from a small town in Wisconsin where we literally left the keys in the ignition, in the car, in the driveway, because we brought the keys out and brought them into the house. My mom would lose the car keys, and I never had a house key. We never, locked our doors. We didn't have to struggle with lack of jobs or food insecurity or any of that. And yet, my household was that tree of adversity, right? And so understanding that it doesn't have to be present. However, if it is present, right, that it kind of adds to all of the other pieces that are in it. And it is more of that cumulative effect when you look at all 3 than just kind of the individual household. Kathy asked if we're collecting data for children who are immigrants and were in cages, etc. We are not. And I wish we were. So that we would, I wish they weren't there, so we didn't have to collect data. But they're not collecting specific data on it, but there are a lot of studies out there of what the impacts of immigration actually has done health-wise, and having that be the adversity. Are there any questions about this slide? Anything that sticks out? Anything that you're thinking? Any thought that it spurred in your head? Anything so far? Okay, well, now that we laid the foundation of adverse childhood experiences have that impact right into adulthood, and definitely understanding all the different pieces that kind of play into it, I want to switch gears, because ACEs often can last a lifetime, but they don't have to. Like, this is, like I said at the beginning, it's not diagnostic. It doesn't have to be. We can always break that cycle, right, of trauma. Healing can occur. And that ACEs can't be predictive. So because I have an ACE score of 7 doesn't mean that I am going to develop heart disease, that I'm going to, have a stroke, that I will attempt suicide. It doesn't mean that it will, but because there's other factors around it that can reduce their impact. And luckily for me, I did have factors that were able to reduce the impact of what ACEs could have had on my body, right? And understanding that we all have that ability to be that impact point, right? To have that ability to mitigate it and to break the cycle. And that's where that trauma informed care comes in, right? That's where that piece comes in, is understanding that that we have a large population. The majority of us are struggling with the effects of childhood adversity, that we can counterbalance that. And it has been shown that at least one stable, caring, and supportive relationship can mitigate a lot of the harm that adverse childhood experiences could potentially cause in that child, therefore adults, life when they get older. And so how do we become that one stable, caring, and supportive relationship, right? How do we help people? And that is really using that trauma-informed lens and using trauma-informed language, changing our thought of how we look. Why are we not coming up? There we go. Of changing the way that we're looking at it from what happened to you instead of what's wrong with you, right? Because a lot of the behaviors that come out are what we would quote bad behaviors. If we have a dysregulated system, someone who has faced a lot of adversity, they're going to be running a little bit higher, right? They're going to be more on alert because they're going to be expecting danger. Their behaviors are going to look as if they are, acting out, or their poor behaviors. They're going to have a lower coping skills. They're going to have a less ability to self-regulate themselves, right? Because their body is in that fight, flight, or freeze stage. The ones that we notice the most are the fight and flight stage, right? When our body is activated to help keep us safe because it detects a threat. And so understanding those pieces and really looking at changing the way we think about it, to looking at what has happened to you, and what need does this meet versus why would you do this? Looking at some of the behaviors, right, and asking that question. I think one people that can relate to the most is substance use disorder, right? A lot of times when we look at substance use disorder, we think like, well, why would you do this? Instead of when we saw the stats, right, in that increase of chances of becoming an IV drug user, right, or of smoking, asking what need does that meet for you, right? And kind of looking at it through that lens. Trauma-informed care itself is a strength-based framework, right? It's grounded in that understanding of and responsiveness to the impact of trauma. And it really emphasizes all the different pieces: emotional, physical, psychological safety. Because that's the foundation that we need to be able to build in order for them to come in, a highly traumatized person to come in, feel safe, so their body stays at that more regulated state. And the ways that we can do that is really looking at SAMHSA's 4 R's of trauma-informed care. Ooh. Which is realizing the widespread impact of trauma, right? Understanding all of the different paths of recovery, but really realizing that trauma is widespread, recognizing it, understanding the signs and symptoms of trauma. That is the recognizing dysregulation, right? And I think the key point here in this is for us to have a better understanding of it, is to understand, how does it look in your life? So what does it look like for you? And you don't have to answer this in the chat, but just thinking about it, what does it look like for you when your body is dysregulated? When you are in that fight or flight stage, what are some of the things that happen? What are some of the things that you experience in your life when you have a really incredibly stressful day? So think about you wake up in the morning and everything is set. You have breakfast, if you eat breakfast, you go to class and everything is going really well. You come home, if they have a really good day, and something happens, like you drop a glass of pickles and it breaks all over your kitchen. What your response is to that happening, versus you woke up late to class, you didn't get to eat, you got to class, you realized that there was a test that was going to happen and you forgot about it, or you didn't feel prepared for it. You found out you got a bad grade. You rushed because you started off your day late. You rushed from one thing to the next, to the next, to the next. You get home and you're absolutely exhausted and you're stressed out. Traffic was really bad on the way home. You just wanted to get home. You just wanted to, go in your refrigerator and have a pickle, and you take out that jar and you drop it on the floor and it breaks. What's the difference of your reactions, right? When those things happen, when you have that really, solid, okay day, and then you have one of those that is just really hard, which we all have, right? Because, well, we're human and those things happen. So what's the difference of your response? And when you recognize how you respond when your body is stressed, when your body is activated, it helps you understand when others are activated, right? When others are maybe having those signs and those symptoms of trauma or toxic stress that is in their life currently. And then responding to it in that kind of trauma-informed way is understanding, that if you had a really bad day and you were in line at a grocery store and something happened and you may have been snippy, that I look at you and understand, hey, I don't know what that person has gone through today. And, but I'll still react in kindness, right? Because it has kind of nothing to do about me, and having that kind of lens when we're looking through it. And then resisting re-traumatization, understanding that we don't want to be the one that activates somebody else unintentionally. And the way that we do that, right, is by understanding that trauma is widespread, understanding and recognizing the symptoms, responding in that trauma-informed way that helps that resisting of re-traumatization. Are there any questions so far? I know that Laura asked, where can one get trained on using trauma-informed language? That is a great question. And I don't know. I will see if there's any training out there. I know that I do training specifically on trauma-informed language when it comes to substance use disorder and mental health. But overall, I'm not quite sure. I'll look into that though and send the information to Marjorie if I find anything so she can put it up on their trauma-informed page that they have, which is amazing at the library. And other key principles to look at is Sam says keys to a trauma-informed approach, right? We're looking at that safety piece, and that safety piece is the whole entire piece. It is the emotional safety, it's the physical safety, right? It's the psychological safety. And when we're looking at creating trauma-informed spaces, we want to look through these 6 key principles, right? What does our location look like? What are our rooms like? How are we responding to people? Are we responding in an emotionally safe way, right? Having trustworthiness and transparency is super key. When people have experienced high levels of trauma in childhood, especially, they are actually wired to recognize inconsistencies. We have to remember that their space that they lived was really dangerous. And so dangerous, at least it felt dangerous within their body. And so their body had to come up with key ways of recognizing when danger was going to happen, right? It was very unpredictable in their life, and they were used to that unpredictability. And so in order to keep a safe space, in order to create a safe space, we need to create a predictable space, and having that trustworthy and that transparency and being honest in it is one of the key pieces to it. Peer support, having other people who understand what they're going through, has been through themselves. I think we all understand what it's like to, struggle someday, and have that friend that we're able to talk to that actually has been through it themselves, or something similar enough to it that you know that you're really being understood and you feel like you're being heard. That collaboration and mutuality is knowing that you have a partner, right? Knowing that you have that kind of support system, that you're working together for a common goal. Making sure that that person who has experienced trauma is empowered, that they have a voice, that they have a choice. Those pieces, that choice piece, that perception that they have control over what is going to happen is incredibly crucial. Like I said, we came from a place, and I say we because I did, right? That, we came from a place that was very chaotic and unpredictable, that we didn't have a choice. It's not like, children who've grown up in adversity can say, hey, I'm going to go get a job and I'm going to move out of my really unsafe neighborhood. It's not something they can do, right? And so if we can give that perception of control, our brain doesn't know whether it's real or whether it's perceived. So it can just be that perception that we have control over it. It helps promote safety within our system. And then understanding the cultural, historical, and gender issues. Women are going to relate to things different than men, just as our brains are different. That's how it is, right? That we all have different cultural differences. We all have different historical differences. What one group faced was not what another group faced, right? My history does not come with, as a white female, does not come with losing my culture. It does not come with losing my land. It doesn't come with being displaced. It doesn't come with being enslaved. It actually comes with really racism and bigotry, right? And understand that those were the issues that were passed down through my family line. And so I will have that different experience and the different kind of issues that come with that. Being female is way different than being male in my experience as far as safety issues. And my husband and I talk about it all the time because he's never experienced it. And so understanding, are we making it safe for both genders there? Are we making it safe for all cultures? What are the different cultures that we represent, that we serve, that we experience? And how can we make it safe within their own cultural, in their own cultural ideals? One of the questions is, how can we know if we are traumatizing our children, and what are some signs or symptoms to look for? That is really good. I'm going to wait. I'm going to answer it after this next slide, because the next two slides are my last slides for this, because that's a really good one. Renee asked if can neurofeedback help change the brains of people who have experienced childhood or trauma in childhood? Absolutely. Absolutely. Things that we'll talk about that to help in that kind of next slide. So we have the foundation of the things that can happen, right? We understand that healing can happen, and it can happen at any time. We understand that creating that trauma-informed place and is incredibly important, and understanding that we're realizing that trauma is widespread. We're recognizing signs and symptoms, which we'll go over a little bit more, responding in a trauma-informed way, and avoiding re-traumatization, right? And that is looking at people and understanding that everybody is powerful, that everybody has that ability, capacity to heal, right? And that when we are dealing with someone who has experienced trauma, the greatest thing we can do for them is to build a safe relationship with them. And building that safe relationship that is nurturing, empathetic, authentic, and empowering. And this can be as simple as not a relationship in the context that we tend to talk about relationships with, but think about that interaction within the grocery store, right? We don't know what that other person is going through, and it may have been a really hard day, and they may be at the end of their rope. However, the interaction with you, because you were authentic, because you were empathetic, because you were kind, could completely and totally change their day, right? Because we are helping them to regulate their own nervous system. And so we want to look at kind of changing the elements of all of our relationships, whether they're the relationship with ourself, which is huge, and changing the relationship within ourselves from abusive to nurturing, from being unresponsive to empathetic, from going from lies and denial to authenticity and honesty, and from controlling to empowering, right? Is to kind of look at, how can we help? How can we be kind? How can we be patient, reassuring, calm? How can we listen? And a lot of times it's really difficult when you're dealing with somebody who has experienced a lot of trauma, because their go-to, just like every other human's go-to, is to keep their body safe. And what that comes out as a lot of times is mood swings, is anger, is irritability, is low patience, right? Because their body is dysregulated. And so in order to keep a regulated space within us, while somebody is behaving in a way that is a lot of times activating to ourselves, is really difficult, right? But it's also the one piece that we have that we can help them to regulate with a concept that's called co-regulation. And so you're modeling being regulated and keeping that calm demeanor. And I think, a lot of us understand if you're really upset, if you're really, activated, and you go in and you're talking to someone and they're really loud and they're really boisterous, that all it does is activate you further, right? But that if you're really upset and you walk in and somebody's like, are you all right? You know, or hi. And they kind of lower their tone and they speak a little slower, then it helps us to have that moment in space to kind of regulate our system. And so how can we be those people in those interactions that are really hard, but how can we, you know, be that person that models what trauma-informed care looks like, so that we can give that other person the ability to get into a space, right, where they feel safe, because that is what is going to allow them to start to heal and to be able to look at things in a little different way, right, when they are dysregulated. Are there any questions? I'm going to start answering the questions that are here, but are there any questions? That was kind of there was a lot of information that we packed really into about 45 minutes. But I really, you know, Marjorie really wanted to have time and space for people to ask questions. And Marjorie, feel free if you have questions to ask also. Going back to the question of how can we know if we are traumatizing our children? What are some signs or symptoms to look for? I will say that I think it is almost impossible to not at some point do something that is going to potentially harm our children, right? Or that they will experience something in their life that is going to affect them, that is going to affect them, right? I mean, I have 4 biological children. My children are 22, 21, 18. She just turned 18 today, and 9. I have 2 bonus children that are 11 and 8. And I've had numerous other children who have been in my life and have lived with me over the years. And I know that they have all experienced trauma in some way or another. So some of the things that we can look for is, you know, signs or symptoms is if we're noticing mood changes, if we are noticing sleeping more, not eating more. The same things that we look for in kind of in depression and anxiety are the things that we would look for in having experienced trauma. Is there something that they used to really like to do before that they're all of a sudden afraid to do now, right? Do they have that kind of anxiety level is up and you haven't noticed? Those are some of the things that we need to look for. They almost typically in children always come out behavior wise. So you're going to have those fight or flight responses, but you may also have freeze. And what freeze looks like is they're withdrawing, right? All of a sudden they're more quiet. All of a sudden they you know, are really compliant where they're normally not. And by compliant, I mean, you know, so you say something and they just immediately do, and that's not something that normally happens, right? Like maybe they would have more of a back and forth with you. My children have never been compliant. They've always been in the fight or flight stage. So, but if when that had happened where things were like, okay, they were more, you know, withdrawn and reserved, then I knew that something was kind of going on. So those are some of the things to look for. And then in responding to that is really having that, that ability to listen, that empathy, and being able to give them that space to being heard, because whatever traumatic, if they have experienced trauma, if they had just gone through a traumatic event, the support that they receive after the event is the most crucial piece to not having long-term effects from the traumatic event that they had experienced. And that is where that kind of healing, that's kind of where that healthy, safe relationship comes in. Anna asked if these safe relationships have to be long lasting. No, They do not have to be long lasting. I was telling Marjorie right before this how my daughter's best friend came, Kate surprised me and came over today, and we hadn't seen her for 9 years. She was in 7th grade when they left, and the girls just both turned 21. And her father in 6th grade had left her. Like, he went to California and he just never came back. And she came and she stayed with us. And just having that little bit of foundation for that year, you know, she's in college, she is on her own. She actually lives in Oregon now, away from, you know, she had moved out on her own, and it didn't have to be a long relationship, right, that we had, but it was enough of a safe, solid relationship that gave her that kind of foundation to move forward. And it really can be as simple as responding in a grocery store and being kind to another human being. We never, ever, 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 ever know the impact of our kindness. We just don't. We just don't. How do you handle when someone is totally disrespectful, but keeping kindness makes them take you for granted and they keep repeating the behavior instead of calming down? Great question, because being trauma informed and understanding how trauma works in a person's body, having predictability, consequences, and boundaries are absolutely key, because not only do you want to have a trauma-informed space for someone else, but you want to have a trauma-informed space for yourself. So in order to honor that, also children who've experienced a lot, adults who've experienced a lot of childhood trauma, they're commonly lacking healthy boundaries because they did not have that in their relationships growing up. And so you modeling healthy boundaries is actually really good. Them understanding that there's consequences, like, I will not be treated this way. This isn't a free pass, like you're being a complete jerk and you're treating me badly. I understand you've had trauma in your past, so okay. No, that is, you know, I understand that you're struggling with this right now. However, you will not talk to me that way, right? You will not treat me that way. These are my personal healthy boundaries. And if you can't respect that, you know, then we're not able to talk. Or once you have calmed down, once we have regulated, we will pick this conversation up, right? Taking that kind of timeout space to bring that regulation down. But having rules in place before they're dysregulated. So when they are in a calm space, creating those rules, right? And then consistently sticking to them yourself to show that you're predictable. Does that make sense? I hope that answers your question. Any tips for not re-traumatizing students in a classroom setting? Mm-hmm. We all do our best, right? And I truly do believe that everybody, when they have knowledge of things, will do their absolute best with it. It's going to be impossible to not activate somebody, because we never know what everybody has faced. If you have noticed that you have activated somebody, that you are honest in it and acknowledge it is actually kind of key. But then also really just having that simple understanding of we just never know what somebody else has gone through. And when we look at it that way and we respond, and we, instead of react, and when we understand that what we think and what we have experienced in our life is not what other people have experienced in their lives, and we actually understand that piece, then we kind of buffer that re-traumatization, right? There's less chance that it is going to happen. It's just even kind of understanding that. So I know that we're right at 1 o'clock, and I don't don't want to go over. I want to be able to honor your all time. We have lots of online publications on the ACEs Consortium website. We also have some online training modules on there, and feel free at any time to reach out to me if there were questions that you had that I wasn't able to answer.
This has been wonderful. Can we share your email?
Oh,
Is
yeah.
that okay? Maybe put that
Absolutely.
in the chat. Yeah, and that azaces.org website is excellent. There's some great resources on there. If anybody wants to visit that. We also have the library guide that was created that also includes some resources and the link to get to ACEs. And I'm going to put that in the chat for everyone as well, if you want to capture that. And of course, this is being recorded, and I'm going to add it to that guide that I just shared the link. But yeah, we're now past our time. I just thank you, Angie. This was wonderful. It was very informative. I hope you all agree. Thank you, all the students that attended. It was great to see all of you. Yeah, so thank you so much. And I hope you all have a great day and you've all been able to walk away and learn something new. I sure have.
Yes, thank you all. Thank you all. And yes, you're more than welcome to share this presentation once Marjorie has it posted.